Good morning. I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation to take part to this conference, Maria for the kind presentation, and especially Petra Bojanic, with whom I had the honor and the pleasure to share in Turin for about 1 year an interesting and amazing research project on new realism, which involved together philosophers and architects. And this is one of the main reasons why I'm working as an architect on realism. Certainly, all historical experience confirms the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. This beautiful statement of Max Weber explains in an exemplary way the link that unites in human action the possible and the impossible in a relationship of mutual need. A relationship that strongly characterizes the architectural thoughts of the 20th century, torn between realism and utopia, and on which I would like to focus my reflection today. The notion of realism appeared in the theoretical debate on architecture in the early 30s of the 20th century, when the realistic assumption proposed on the occasion of the First Congress of Soviet Writers in Moscow in 1934 were claimed as the official creative method and were subsequently adopted by all artistic disciplines, also in architecture. This notion appears immediately as ambiguous and contradictory, straddling between idealism and ideology, innovative research and nostalgic historicism. If indeed realism proposes itself as a critical tool for overcoming the functionalism and the technicality of avant-gardes, it leads, in fact, with an amazing logical leap to the opposite extreme, i.e. the most exasperated formalism addressed to the exaltation of the past in its most rhetoric forms. You can see two famous examples of this attitude. The failure of socialist realism on the political and social level and the crisis of its architectural image of propaganda, emphatic and monumentalist, clearly shows the utopian character of the realist dream, but don't erase its imaginative positive power in which architecture had played a central role in striving to build a better world. Maybe that's why, after the Second World War, the question of realism comes again into discussion, especially in Italy, as an alternative to the modern paradigm, no less utopian, which was seeking absolute laws in defining space and conforming shape. In 1949, the young Aldo Rossi joined the Faculty of Architecture at the Politecnico di Milano and participated actively in the political life of the school. During these years, he began his militancy in the Italian Communist Party and wrote a few articles relating to architecture and industrial design for the newspaper Voce Comunista. In 1951, he took part in a trip to Moscow organized by the party that would strongly impact his architectural imaginary. You see two pictures of this trip. In October 1955, he participated in the conference Communist Architects, and he presented a written speech, his first position on the topic of realism in architecture. In the same year, 1955, Aldo Rossi joined the editorial staff of the architectural magazine Casabella Continuità, of which Ernesto Nathan Rogers has taken the direction in 1952. Rogers himself, first in 1962, devotes an issue of Casabella to USSR with the aim of documenting Soviet architecture from a phenomenological and not ideological point of view in quotation, reality of things, end of quotation, and in its relationship to the life of the people, focusing attention on the form-content relationship as a problem of architecture. You see the editorial with the title Russia, form and content. Only a few months before, he had published an editorial on Casabella Continuità with the eloquent title Utopia of Reality, and 3 years later, under the same title, he will edit a book about the school where the ambitious goal of architecture appears to reconcile the free and open-minded dimension of university education with the practical needs of life. Quotation, to transform reality in its deepest essence, in the moral and political, as well in the didactic and pedagogic fields. End of quotation. Roger's idea is in fact that utopia is not always, quotation, a vain or unfounded picture or chimera, bouncy castle, etc., according to the cold definition of dictionaries, but on the contrary, that it can be a teleological charge that projects the present in a possible future, even if its forms are still unrealizable. End of quotation. We must, according to Rogers, activate the concept of utopia. That is, quotation, concrete thinking towards a better society, in a world built with real media for real purposes. End of quotation. Far from contradicting the meaning of utopia, Rogers identifies its progressive aspect. Utopia is not something opposed to reality, an escape from necessity, but it is a tension inherent in each project to loftier goal, even if far remote. Utopia, thus, is an approach to the possible. This vision is actually already contained in the concept of continuity that Rogers offers as an antidote to the crisis of modernism. He rejects the tabula rasa and all forms of dogmatism, functionalist or formalist, and proposes, on the contrary, a phenomenological interpretation of architecture in which possible words are in any case debtors to the real world and also to the architects who contributed to build it. It is a vision that focuses on the link art-life, utopia reality, seeing the architectural design as a process that is performed by a sense of reality, which pushes toward the satisfaction of need and by a sense of possibility open to imagination. Since the early post-war years in Italy, there was a discussion on realism in architecture alongside and in correspondence to what was happening in literature, painting or cinema. The Roman neighborhood Tiburtino and some works by Mario Ridolfi, like the towers in Viale Etiopia in Rome, are among the exemplary achievement of that time. Examples that show how this idea of realism has not gone beyond these stylistic choices of adherence to popular architecture and the use of a vernacular architectural language without a true understanding of the structural transformation of the city and the territory, at least in the opinion of the younger generation. But on the basis of this insight, the attention to reality comes back to the core of the theoretical discussion on architecture in the 70s, and with it the notion of realism as a key word in overcoming the legacy of modernism, both in relation to the American postmodern proposal and, above all, in relation to the Italian architecture of the Tendenza. Aldo Rossi dedicates an important contribution in the seminary Urban Analysis and Architectural Design, held during his course at the Faculty of Architecture of the Polytechnic School of Milan in academic year 1978-1979, under the title The Idea of Socialist City in Architecture. This essay, while not speaking specifically of realism, covers many topics that will be brought back by Rossi to this theme in subsequent years. In particular, the reference to the thought of Friedrich Engels and to his definition of realism. Realism means, in my opinion, says Engels, apart from the fidelity to detail, faithful reproduction of typical characters, in typical circumstances. This definition closely combines realism and typological thinking, and thus, with the next step, realism and rationalism. In the syllabus of the course held by Aldo Rossi in the academic year 1970-71 at the Faculty of Architecture of the Polytechnic School of Milan, one of the key points concerns the question of realism in architecture. The notion of realism, according to Rossi, is inextricably linked to the issue of rational architecture, and the aim of the course is to pose the question of the relationship between architectural rationalism and realism. Quotation, meaning by the first a rational and progressive choice with respect to the construction of an autonomous discipline, by the second a definition of the aspects of the discipline which link it to reality. End of quotation. In March 1971, Rossi gave a lecture entitled Realism in Architecture. The lecture was recorded, but Rossi never wanted to reread and correct the transcription and never authorized the publication, what he did for other of his lessons. He thought probably it was too ideological and he was already forward. The realist formulation of Rossi are therefore linked on the one side to the modern movement, collecting in this sense the legacy of Rogers, and on the other side to Marxism, filtered in Italy through the aesthetics of Georgi Lukács, but also to the cinematographic neorealism and the recovery of the magic realism of the metaphysical painting in the visual arts in a composite and varied plot. Mention may be made in this regard, as the climax of the discussion, to the exhibition Les Réalismes, curated by Jean Clair at the Centre Pompidou in Paris a few years later in 1980. This position is also evident in the choice of the not at all homogeneous project submitted the year after at the 15th Triennale of Milan, Rational Architecture, coordinated by Aldo Rossi himself. And above all, in the movie Ornamento e Delitto, Ornament and Crime, with reference to the famous essay by Adolf Loos, 1910, presented at the same Triennale, where, in a complex assembly of pieces of neo-realist movies, Visconti, Bolognini and Fellini, with texts by Adolf Loos, Walter Benjamin, Karl Marx and Hans Schmidt, paintings by Sironi alternate with images of Lenin's funeral. Therefore, the notion of realism does not appear as an univocal category, neither as a shared position. The issue number 13 of the Swiss magazine Archithese, edited by Stanislaw von Moos and published in 1975 in collaboration with the American architects Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, with the title Realismus in der Architektur, Las Vegas, etc., is representing an opposite view on this subject. Von Moos identifies realism as the anti-modernist position of American architecture of Venturi and Scott Brown, who, quotation, based their theory at the same time on trivial words and on the past, Baroque Rome if necessary, and sharply criticized post-Le Corbusier and post-Mies academicism. These studies on Las Vegas, focusing the reflection on consumption society and stylistic eclecticism, fully express the distance from the modern paradigm, with its absolute principles in defining shapes and space, that the Italian rational architecture tried, however, to recover. It is, writes von Moos, an attempt to respond to a crisis situation in a realistic way. This answer consists in adapting to contemporary visual reality, in giving up the traditional role of architecture as producer of utopias as alternative to reality. According to this point of view, realism in architecture would consist in replacing great utopias with day-to-day reality, values implicit in reality with irony. The project is an awareness of reality, not a possible alternative. But already in the following Here, on number 19 of Archithese, bearing the title Realismus Realism, the point of view seems radically changed. This issue, this time monographic and edited by Bruno Reichlin and Martin Steinmann, offers an ambitious project with a foundational character. Quotation, the word realism is used here for a critical review of the very notion of architecture. End of quotation. Indeed, the editorial, signed at four hands, bears the title on the immanent reality of architecture and decidedly and directly refers to the formulation of socialist realism and the aesthetics of Lukács. Lukács' definition, describing architecture as a real fact resulting at the same time from a social reality and from a formal reality, seems better than any other to understand the specific quality of architecture. Certainly a reality, but a concrete reality evolving in time. And the place of this evolution is history. If socialist realism, as worked out before the Second World War, was opposed to the materialist realism of the Neues Bauen, the new rationalist realism rehabilitates the modern, complementing it, however, with a new historical dimension, and opposes the impressionist realism of American studies. Aldo Rossi, with his project for the Town Hall of Scandicci, 1968, and with the Galaratese Quarter in Milan, 1970-72, seems mostly directly to embody this attitude. Also in the second formulation, depicted through many examples of modernism and some contemporary projects, by Rossi, Grassi, but also Sterling and Venturi, realism looms as an overcoming of modern to a recovery of historical values. Aldo Rossi writes in the short essay Une éducation réaliste, quotation, initially I saw realism as a replacement solution. First of all, it was superiorly fighting the grey and penitentiary aspects of modern architecture. And also, I was looking for a daily and ancient realism. This is in opposition to the inductive method, from actual examples to theory and not vice versa, proposed by Dennis Scott Brown in her essay Science of Life, Symbols in American City, where she refers to, quotation, the concept of reality as an empirical one based on a sociological or architectural perception rather than on a philosophical thought. In December of the same year, from the pages of Casabella, with the paper Some Ideas on Realism, Leon Krier, another important protagonist, enters the debate, introducing the idea of realism as a collective language of architecture and code in popular culture and tradition. We will meet him again shortly thereafter on the issue number 190 of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, edited by Bernard Huet, 1977, with the title Formalisme Réalisme. This issue mostly deals again with the same themes and include the same paper as the issue of Archithese, the short essay by Rossi, accompanied by a long interview, as you can see here, those by Giorgio Grassi and by Reichlin and Steinmann, however, marks a significant shift. Massimo Scolari and the Kriers move in, and the Americans definitively step out. Moreover, besides the essays, an important iconographic apparatus is present. This is not trifling. The initial fascination for socialist architecture having been overtaken, realism seems to identify itself on one side with the rationalism of the Tendenza, geographically located in Italy, Spain, and Canton of Ticino, and on the other with the rising phenomenon of urban reconstruction, which in the following year will generate the catalogue of the exhibition Rational Architecture, Architecture Rationnelle, Reconstruction of the European City. The complexity and richness of this discussion in a dialectical relationship with the projects and the buildings is evident in the article by Jorge Silvetti on realism in Architecture, published in the Harvard Architecture Review 1980, but dated March 1978. Silvetti takes into consideration the problem of realism with respect to the legacy of modern architecture, focusing on the aspect of the figuration, and in particular on its refusal to deal with the past as a figurative reference. The question of realism arises here in purely formal terms. What is the reality with which architecture can establish figurative relationships when the confrontation with its own history is no longer possible as a reference? This opens the field to the disciplinary discussion between autonomy and heteronomy, between typology and iconographic interpretation of architecture, between permanence and contingency. Silvetti clearly grasped, in fact, the two opposite faces of the notion of realism in those years, already highlighted by the above-mentioned issues of Architese. The populist one of postmodernism, which relies on a narrative method and uses the image of the past in a visual and formal way, and the neo-rationalist one, which again looks at the historical architecture, searching however not images and suggestions, but general and abstract operational categories for the project. In the one case, realism is expressed as a quotation verisimilitude based on common knowledge, rejecting a programmatic, promising but yet not existing real, end of quotation, that accepts the world as it is. And in the other case, architecture itself and the city are the real to deal with in a perspective of progressive development. Therefore, the discussion on realism moves in a certain sense into the field of dialectics, morphology, typology, or construction, reconstruction, deconstruction, that in architecture is not only a conceptual operation, but is a physical, real question. This position is emblematically presented in the booklet of architectural design of 1989 with the title Reconstruction, Deconstruction, in which Peter Eisenman and Leon Krier face each other in the dialogue, "My ideology is better than yours." Beyond the colloquial and provocative character of this dialogue, some interesting aspects emerge in it, just concerning the dialectics between present and history, innovation and tradition, practical and evocative value of architecture, which are the center of the discussion on realism as the aspiration to a better society. The last episode, which marked in a certain sense the conclusion of this story, is again on Architese on number 1990, with the title Dirty Realism. It begins with an editorial by Liane Lefebvre, whose introduction leaves no doubt. Quotation, "A new trend in architecture begins to appear with a notable coherence in several world regions, from California to Catalonia, from London to Lyon, from Berlin to New York, from Zurich to Tokyo. Far from being strictly architectural, it is also present in different cultural fields, for example in cinema, in music and literature. Actually, precisely from literature, the definition dirty realism is borrowed, used by William Bufford on the Literary Review Granta, as you could see before. In addition to the difficulty of understanding who are these new realists from all over the world, beside Rem Koolhaas, to which the text directly refers to, the idea of a positive principle as an opening of the real to the possible that hitherto characterize the notion of realism applied to architecture seems here completely disappeared. For some time now, however, a new spectre or ghost is haunting Europe. Starting from the Manifesto of New Realism, proposed by the Italian philosopher Maurizio Ferraris on the pages of the newspaper La Repubblica in August 2011, and as a book a few months later, 2012, a new season of thought called of New Realism has begun in Europe with the aim of bringing to discussion in philosophy, politics and everyday life the notion of realism as an antidote to the open and disenchanted vision of the world as a system of signs and images to be freely interpreted and transformed that characterized the last 20 years. It is certainly not a coincidence that just a few weeks later, on the occasion of the opening of the retrospective exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, from the pages of the same newspapers, critics, and also the same protagonists of that controversial season, sanctioned with undeniable relief the end of the postmodernism and the overcoming of the hedonistic lightness that characterized the 80s and that in architecture was embodied by the game of forms and deformation outside the convention and without rules. Architecture, more than any other artistic expression, is in fact touched into the heart by this debate because of its reality and its close relationship with economy and society. Architecture contributes significantly in constructing the physical environment in which we live, and the problem of the production of images is in architecture a matter of great importance insofar as there is no difference in a building between representation and reality of the work. It should therefore not be surprising to find interest rising among architects by a line of thought in which reality, what exists, is a hard core which is necessary to face. A new openness toward the real means a greater attention to the external world as it is and as it was, and also a chance to rehabilitate a concept of truth as experience in relation to our daily action. Therefore, after the disillusionment of tendenzious rationalism, the excesses of the postmodern age, and the sophistry of deconstruction, also in architecture emerged the interest in tackling reality again in order to build a better world. Once completed the critique of postmodernism, says Ferraris, it is the matter for contemporary philosophy to move on to a constructive phase, to rebuild the construction. That does not mean to return to order, and which then, but to develop a philosophy which strives to account for the whole of reality, from physics to the social world. The possibilities are produced by the impact of reality, without thereby philosophy being reduced to a fragmented vision and renouncing to provide an overall sense of the real. Also in architecture, we can see an attempt to think again about reality as a critical tool to reflect on the current state of architecture, on its historical reality, on the urban reality, and more generally on its concrete reality. My research has focused in particular on Berlin and Germany from the IBA in the 80s until today. Example range from the block 275 in Schützenstrasse by Aldo Rossi to the townhouses in Friedrichswerder until the extreme case of the Domrömer area in Frankfurt. We could really talk in architecture about reconstruction, not in the sense of a restoration, but of a mindset which sees in reality not just something inherently negative that resists and opposes the change, but the actual source of the possibilities. As Roger argued, it is actually possible to talk about realistic utopia as a way of exploring alternative possibilities within the space that the world offers us. Maybe it's realism of today's great utopia. Thank you very much.